My name is Jae June Lee. I'm a researcher at the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, housed in the Georgetown Law Center. I'll be playing the role of moderator for this fourth session titled Topics and Use Case Analyses of Noisy Measurements File. The purpose of this session is to bring together a group of people, primarily stakeholders in the civil rights universe. And my hope is that in these conversations in this session, we can help uncover census use cases, use case communities, and issues that are primarily important to us and try to convey their importance. I'd like to thank the organizers for pulling together this fabulous workshop, echoing a lot of other speakers here today. I think it's really important that we're having this conversation. I am delighted to welcome first here in person, Fred McBride, who is a senior policy analyst at the Southern Poverty Law Center, Karin McDonald, who's on the screen there, a director of Statewide Database and Election Administration Research Center at UC Berkeley. We have William O'Hare, who is the president of O'Hare Data and Demographic Services, Terry-Al Minnis, senior director of census voting programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and Gwynne Evans-Lomayesva, who is a former researcher at the National Congress of American Indians and a former chair of the Census Information Center Network, and a future demographer. So here's the format, just to give you an idea of what to expect over the next 90 minutes. Just the first thing to say that, yes, this will be a panel discussion. We wanted to shake up the format and just mostly have moderated conversations, a couple of rounds of them. We'll have an opportunity for the panelists to offer some spontaneous thoughts and reflections, and then we'll move it over to having a conversation with the audience. Let me just move this closer to my mouth. Great, and unfortunately, one of our panelists, Terry, does have a hard stop at 5 p.m., and so we're hoping to get through as much as we can before that, before we open it up. So with that, let's jump right in, and we're going to start doing a little prelude here to get some of the main themes and use cases and ideas across. So for the first question, Fred, I'd like to start with you. So as I think the previous panel covered, that was really interesting and important and kind of makes our jobs a bit easier, is that one of the primary use cases of the census is redistricting, and as we like to say, the census numbers form the statistical backbone of our democracy. So so I wonder if you could speak a bit more about your background and the work that you've been doing around redistricting and voting rights.
Thank you, Jae June, and that's a little loud. Can you hear me? Okay, all right, because this is a lot. I'll go ahead. Thank you, Jae June. I am a senior policy analyst, thank you, at the Southern Poverty Law Center. However, my background is redistricting and voting rights for, I'm going to tell my age, about 23 years now. And after the third redistricting cycle, I was like, I've had enough. So let's do something else, or let's try to do something else. But redistricting follows me wherever I go. And it's the child that graduated from high school that you actually don't want to leave the house. You want them to stay. And I love it. I've been doing it over 3 decades. So I'm glad to be here with you. For redistricting, actually Sam saved me a lot of time going over what it takes to bring about a Section 2 voting rights case. That is a great deal of my background over several civil rights organizations, nonprofit, and serving as an expert witness in Section 2 voting rights cases. And as Sam discussed earlier in the last panel, before you even bring a case, you've got to do 3 things. You've got to show you can draw a district where the minority group in question is comprised of over 50% of voters. You've got to show that that minority group in question is cohesive. They vote for the same candidate over a series of elections. And lastly, you've got to demonstrate, or you've got to show through quantitative analysis, that the non-minority group actually votes as a block, which often leads to the minority preferred candidate losing. You show that, and you're on your way to a Section 2 lawsuit. There are some other aspects called Senate factors, which you have to also bring in this totality of circumstances in a Section 2 case. That is also quantitative and qualitative, which we don't have to talk about a divide there. They actually complement each other. So having gone through all of that, why am I here? I can do none of this without reliable census data, without accurate census data. To draw a district, I go to census files. I have to go to the PL 94-171 data. I will say, I'm going to close shortly, I'll talk a lot. I will say that I got a call about 12 years ago from someone who said, I don't know how they found me, but they were led to me and they said, I'm drawing a city plan, a city council plan, and I said, it's 2009. What data did you use? And he said, well, we use housing patterns. I said, I thought it was a joke. But now it's not so funny, in a sense, because there seems to be a myriad of other types of things that people may be considering. I won't get into my thoughts of that, but what brings me here today is the fact that I'm always asked, not every 10 years, every year, Fred, can you draw us a good district? I said, let me see. In order to do that, I have to have good data. By good, I mean accurate and reliable. So that's what brings me here, and hopefully we can explore a lot of that later in this time that I'm spending with you this afternoon. Thank you, Jae June.
Great, thank you, Fred. Yeah, we'll have a chance to dig a bit deeper into these use cases in a second. And moving over to Terry, you also have deep expertise in redistricting and voting rights, though your training and background is perhaps slightly different from Fred's. I wonder if you could speak more about the use cases and your particular interests in voting rights and redistricting and the particular use case communities that you're concerned with.
June, and agree with Fred. I feel like my response is simplified by saying please see above previous session as well as Fred's comments. You know, I think at the end of the day, with respect to redistricting data, that was our primary concern or focus when we were looking at the whole issue around differential privacy and the use of differential privacy for the Census Bureau's disclosure avoidance system for the 2020 census. We engaged in some research with MALDEF on some of the earlier demonstration products of the versions of the PL file. And, you know, the research did raise some concerns, right? The primary thing, I think, as many have discussed, when you look in the aggregate, okay, perhaps there isn't a lot of differences, but as has been expressed by many, especially in the redistricting context, the smallest amount really makes a difference, can really matter. And so for us, our main concern was this idea of sort of, you know, the DP data being potentially sort of really at the margins, you know, potentially having sort of false positive, false negatives, right? Where because of the application of DP, you might have some districts that don't appear to be viable that should be, and vice versa. And I think ultimately, and I know a number of folks that have raised this issue, it's also there's a unknown, like there are some things we just can't know, right? Because we can't have access to the all of the underlying data. So I think that is where it's interesting to see whether this conversation, you know, what might be learnable with a noisy measurement file being released. At the same time, I think, you know, with the policy hat that I always wear, you can't sort of, for me, you can't untie that from the realities on the ground, on the realities of like, what does it mean? And I know others have raised this, what does it mean to have a second set of numbers? How do we explain that to our community members? How do we ensure, because I think as others have noted, it's very complicated about people's willingness to participate in the census or not. I can certainly say from our perspective, it was a lot of work, right? People might, you know, point to the Asian American overcount in the, from the PES as in indication that there are no issues, but that's certainly not true, and I know we'll get into that a little bit later, but just wanted to flag that when we're talking about this, we really can't ever take it away from, it can't just be an academic endeavor. We always have to remember there could be real life unintended consequences, and we have to think through all of that as we're thinking and wrestling with how these things can, manifest themselves.
Great, thank you, Terry. Karin, moving over to you and continuing this use case of redistricting, you direct the statewide database, which is responsible for collecting and processing data for California's redistricting. Could I ask you to just kind of describe your work, and if you wouldn't mind just briefly introducing this idea of prison gerrymandering and prison reallocation, but we'll get into that a bit later.
Can do that. Thank you so much, Jae June. Thank you for having me at this conference, and thanks, Jae June, for organizing the best organized panel I have ever been on. I'm really happy to be here with friends and colleagues and co-authors. And I'll tell you a little bit about the California statewide database. It's called the statewide database. Probably not the best name for it. So at this point, because there's many statewide databases, of course, this one refers to the redistricting database for the state of California. It is being used for California statewide redistricting and for voting rights assessments and for line drawing, basically. It is a public, transparent, block-level data set that is produced at the end of the decade. So the block-level data set is produced at the end of the decade. And in between, we make precinct-level data available along with equivalency files that allow for people to go from precinct to precinct, basically from different elections. One thing that people that are not familiar with California data or elections data don't realize is that in California, our precincts change very frequently. I get a lot of questions about why do you all not participate in the VTD program? And the reason is that by the time the VTDs come out, our precincts have changed at least 3 or 4 times already. Sometimes we get 80% of precinct changes statewide between a general and a primary and a general election. So what we do at Statewide Database is we collect a lot of data. We process a lot of data. We normalize the data. We make it available publicly. So the database, a redistricting database, which probably everybody knows at this conference, generally just consists of census data. So we start with the PL94, and again, just echoing what Fred just said, we rely on accurate data because everything that we do just really starts with the PL94. And also wanted to just thank Clark Benson, who was on the last panel. Thank you so much, Clark, for explaining so many of the issues that I wanted to raise and for bringing them to everybody's attention. Clark, of course, is also a colleague, and we work together at NCSL quite a bit and have, especially over the last decade or so. So anyway, back to the statewide database. We start with the PL94. We add a statement of vote data from the 58 counties in California, and then registration data, voter registration data. We collect data from each statewide election. We have more statewide elections these days than we care to talk about, because now we have recalls and special elections and so forth. Then we also make this citizen voting age population data available. That's the only variable we pull from the American Community Survey. And that, of course, is made available because it's necessary for line drawing, for voting rights assessments, and so forth. Previously, in previous decades, our main clients, quote unquote, really was the legislature until California went to a commission, an independent redistricting commission. The data were previously used mostly for legislative, congressional, Board of Equalization, redistricting. But then in 2019, the Fair Maps Act was passed in California, and that mandated that all local jurisdictions also use the statewide database for redistricting. And another little thing to know about California is we have our own Voting Rights Act. It's called the California Voting Rights Act, and this is also something to file away because it increases your client pool. There are other other states that also have local voting rights acts that basically push local jurisdictions under certain circumstances to go from at-large to by-district elections. So your clients are becoming more and more in this space. For California, we had to allocate data from incarcerated populations after the release of the PL 94 for the first time this time. And that means that all of our clients were also mandated to use these data. And again, our client pool has gone up by, hundreds, probably thousands at this point. And that meant for us that there was a lot of messaging to explain to people which data sets they had to use to not, basically get ahead of themselves and use data that were not adjusted. They had to wait, which was really difficult for a lot of people because we had a lot of deadlines, and because the census was late, of course, everybody really wanted to get started, and they had to wait for us, which didn't make us more popular. But we were plenty popular afterwards once they finally got the data. But basically, we just do a lot of messaging, a lot of training, and a lot of trying to make sure that people are not using software vendors that missed the message that California has to use adjusted data and not the data that the census pushes out. So there was a lot of that going on. So I'll talk more in detail about what it meant for us to reallocate incarcerated population data. It was not easy. And, also I should probably just mention, because it makes more sense in the context of other things that are coming later, that I am the liaison for California to the Census Bureau, which means that I am the person that squawks a lot to them and complains a lot to them. And also with another hat on, I'm a line drawer, redistricting consultant by night once in a while, and I've been the principal consultant to the California Redistricting Commission a couple of times. So from that perspective, I'm also very familiar with what an actual client on the ground sees when they're looking at these data. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Karin. Moving on to Gwynne. Now, you're deeply familiar with the data on American Indians and Alaska Natives, including on tribal lands. I wonder if you could speak more about the work that you've done at NCAI when you were formerly there as a researcher, and maybe talk about the different use cases that are important to tribal governments and communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks. Hello, everyone. As Jae June said, my name is Gwynne Evans-Lomayesva. I am a Hopi tribal member, and I formerly led the National Congress of American Indians Census Information Center, as well as I was their researcher for their Policy Research Center. I also chaired the National Census Information Center Network, which is a partnership program with the U.S. Census Bureau. So I'm continuing my work with census data through my PhD program in demography beginning this fall, which I'm very excited about. Just a little plug there. So much of my work has had me directly working with tribal leaders, tribal communities, experts in the field, and of course, the U.S. Census Bureau. So my previous work on census data involved data tracking during the enumeration phase on the tribal geographies, examining the implementation of the privacy algorithm on the American Indian, Alaska Native racial data and the AIAN, NH geographies, and then as well as looking at how the PL file came out and educating the tribal communities on different use cases, as well as connecting that with the U.S. Census Bureau. So census data really is pivotal to tribal nations for governance, particularly for tribal nations that rely on decennial census data as a primary source for population data. And that could be used for governance like, emergency management planning, infrastructure, education, and the like. Sometimes it really is the only source of data folks have to use. So it's really important that it's accurate. Then, of course, the census data is pivotal to federal funding. Some federal funding sources specifically require the use of census data, and they don't necessarily offer alternatives to those sources, last I checked. So accuracy is really important for those use cases. And then, of course, as I head into my program next fall, the research use case is also very pivotal to tribal nations as well, because that helps inform them and coordinate with them. So accuracy of census data allows for more accuracy in the governance, the planning, more accurate funding, more accurate research analyses, and of course, then the representation within different levels of government. So use cases are impacted by that data accuracy, and tribal nations with inaccurate or disproportionate losses will see losses in funding that they shouldn't have had and that is needed for their population, whereas other tribal nations or other governments may see population increases that aren't reflected in reality, but will increase their funding that could have been needed elsewhere. So that's one of the biggest use cases that I can think of. And then again, not all tribal nations have the means to collect their own detailed population data, and so they really do rely on census data. And additionally, there are 574 federally recognized tribes within the United States, and so I can give these big buckets as to governance, funding, research, representation, but there are so many other very specific use cases that change for each of the different tribal nations. And not all tribal nations have someone who's an expert for them in all their data uses or centralized knowledge. So it really is, there's so many different use cases for tribal nations that do use census data, but it's difficult to gather them all. And again, remember that there are over 500 tribal nations, and they're all different and are going to see different impacts due to their different sizes. So kind of got off the question there, I apologize. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen. Moving over to you, Bill, finally. So you've done a lot of work and you've written a lot about census evaluation methods. And in particular, I think one of the things that we all know you for is the work that you've done on the undercount of young children and perhaps the importance of accurate census data for advancing child well-being. Could you say a bit more about your background and kind of the work that you're doing, and I'll follow up with a second question as we pivot over into the second section.
Sure. Well, thanks, first of all, to Jae June for organizing this and inviting me, and also the conference organizers for allowing me to be part of this event today and tomorrow. I think it's useful that I only understood some of the stuff that was talked about in the last, so it makes me think I'm pushing my envelope, or I'm learning more than I would if I were in some other places. So thank you for the opportunity. I'll start by saying that I first got involved in the decennial census in 1970 when I was taking a course in the spring of 1970 on population, and it involved the census. Subsequent to that, I was in graduate school, and the results of the 1970 census started to come out on computer tape for the first time. So I got involved in the census and the census data at that point in my career. It was also at the same time was representing the state of Michigan in the federal state cooperative program for population estimates. So it gave me a little flavor of that use of census data. And you heard more about that this morning, I guess, from some of the people in that network. I should also mention, I guess I've been on the Census Bureau, a couple of Census Bureau advisory committees. I was a research fellow there for a couple of years after the 2010 census. I've been a consultant to the Bureau from 2015 to around 2020. And as Jae June kind of mentioned, I pay attention to census accuracy, and I think one of the niches I filled is trying to communicate that statistical accuracy to stakeholder groups that are not necessarily statisticians or demographers or data analysts. The other thing that Jae June mentioned, the last 30 years of my professional life, I've been focused on children and the well-being of children, and used an awful lot of Census Bureau data in that aspect. And just close by saying in the 2020 census, I was involved in organizing the Count All Kids campaign, which was an effort to get child advocates and stakeholder groups interested in children involved in the 2020 census to try and get a more accurate count of young children. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of my background to put my later comments in context.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you, Bill. And so I think as we pivot over to this, the second section now, is putting this idea of noisy measurements and the type of measurable error that that it may provide in context of, I think, the general issue of accuracy in the underlying data as well, and how we kind of think about that. But before I guess we go there, I know that you have a couple of slides just to kind of maybe set us up in the conversation about, and it was mentioned in a couple other sessions here today as well, but really setting us and kind of making it clear what exactly census evaluation looks like, the different methods and the different components to it, just so that I think we're all on the same page and understand what's going on.
Did you see my slides, Jae June?
Yeah, but you might want to click, yeah,
There we go.
awesome, thanks.
So I'm going to try and get through a very dense set of information as quickly as I can. I'll start with talking about the way the Census Bureau understands their accuracy of the decennial census. And there's two basic methods they've been using, both of them for the last 3 or 4 decades. The first one is generally called the post-enumeration survey. Sometimes it's referred to as dual system estimates. And that method, they take a large sample right after the data collection period has ended for the census, and then compare the results of that sample. They ask the same kind of questions that the census asked. Compare the results of that sample to the census records to determine who was missed and who was overcounted or counted twice. So it's a very much more complex than what I've just said here, but that's the basic idea behind the post-enumeration survey. The second method that they use is called demographic analysis. In that method, the Bureau maintains a population database calculated on births and deaths and net immigration, and have maintained that for many decades. So they have an idea of how many people in each demographic category to expect in the census. For example, if they know that there were 500 black male infants born 5 years ago, and 2 of them died, they know how many should be counted in the 2020 census. That wasn't a very good example, but you hopefully understand they've got this ongoing system that they think is very accurate at the national level. They compare the census count to their expectations and determine if they have undercounts or overcounts. See if I can go to the next slide here. There we go. So let me give you 3 statistics from the Census Bureau that relate to census accuracy, but they provide very different perceptions, I think, of the quality of the 2020 census. The first one is net undercount. And in the 2020 census, the Bureau estimated they missed about 800,000 people, which is about 1/4%. And that's a pretty good record in terms of international or historic standards, a pretty low net undercount. But one of the drawbacks of this is that a net undercount could mean, a net undercount of 0 could mean that no one is missed, or that 10% were missed and 10% were double counted. So other methods are more detailed data is really useful. The second measure here is omissions. That's defined by the Bureau as people who should have been counted in the census but were not. And there's almost 19 million people missed in the census, and that's 5.7% of the population, of the counted population. And I want to take an aside here. I think when most people think about census errors, they think about omission. People missed, people left out. And I also say that, the census communication in 2000 and most of the advocacy groups talked about trying to make sure people weren't missed in the census. So I think from a kind of a common understanding of census error, this is what people think about. And as it suggests, almost 19 million people were missed in the 2020 census. In addition to the 19 million people missed, there were millions who were counted twice or counted inappropriately or imputed. When you put those kinds of errors, people counted who shouldn't have been, along with people missed, it's about 37 million people, and that's 11.4% of the population. So those are all accurate data, and accurate the Bureau could produce, I think reasonable, but each one of them give you a very different perception, I think, of how the quality of the 2020 census, how good the quality of the 2020 census was. Let me move on to differential undercounts in the census, which was alluded to earlier. And in my mind, the national data for all groups is really not very meaningful. What's most important in the census is getting low differences amongst groups in terms of census accuracy or census coverage. This slide, I hope, is pretty self-explanatory, but it goes, the population groups go on the bottom, the bars that go down from 0 are net undercounts, the bars that go up are net overcounts. And you can see that non-Hispanic white alone and Asians had net overcounts of 1.6 and 2.6%. I want to make sure right now that there's still a mystery about the net overcount for Asians, in part because it's unclear how much this average for Asians overall reflects diversity amongst the Asian population in terms of subgroups. That's an open question, I think, that it's not so unclear. On the other hand, those are the overcounted groups. The undercounted groups were Black at 3.3%, Hispanics at 5%, and then American Indians and Alaskans on reservations have a very high net undercount. The point being that there's a lot of differences across these race groups in terms of census accuracy. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit in another context. As I mentioned, one of the areas I focus on is children, and particularly young children in the census. And this chart shows the net undercounts and overcounts in 2020 for the 5-year age groups along the bottom. Again, the bars that go up from 0 are net overcounts, and the bars that go down from 0 are net undercounts. And I'll direct your attention to the far left-hand side there, where it shows that young children, 0 to 4, had a net undercount of 5.4%, higher than any other group, much higher than any other group for that matter. And I think this chart also shows another way in which there's some differential census coverage by age. I'll try to move through this quickly, but this is a chart that shows net undercount for adults in the blue line, young children in the gray dotted line. And you can see after 1980, coverage for adults continued to improve, but the coverage for young children plummeted. And the main point here is to make the point that the 5.4% in 2020 is not an outlier. The last couple censuses, young children have had a very high net undercount relative to adults. One of the issues this raises for me, so I can go back here. It's the end of my slides. So I look at the high net undercount of young children, 4.5%. And I think of it in two ways relative to differential privacy. Part of me says, or one perspective says, well, this group is already undercounted, has so much error in it already that we shouldn't put any more error in it using differential privacy, that somehow we should come up with a method that doesn't inject more error into this group that already has a lot of error in it. The other perspective that I think about is that, this group has so much error already that the little error added by DP doesn't matter. And I kind of go back and forth between those two, and I welcome anybody's comments on how this should be viewed. I guess when groups had very high net undercounts in the census or errors, should DP treat them differently, I guess is what I'm saying there. I've been talking about accuracy, and that's what most of today has been talking about, but I want to talk about a different term and a little different concept, and that is equity. And I think, it's a term that we should apply to any data set, I guess, but particularly decennial census data in this context. And I don't know that we have, in fact, I'm pretty sure we don't have a good summary measure of equity, whether the 2020 census was more equitable or less equitable than 2010. I think in many ways, when you think I look at it, it's less equitable because the differences are bigger. But I think we could use a common measuring device or metric is the way, I guess, of measuring equity within the census. And if we can develop that measure of equity, it would be interesting to look at the 2010 census in terms of equitability before and after the application of differential privacy. I don't really know whether differential privacy affects the equity of the data or not. I don't have a keen sense of that, but organizers who asked us to think about questions statisticians could address. This is one that comes to mind. Let me make a couple more comments and I'll be through. One is a big difference between the accuracy measure of DP-infused data through the demonstration product, where we compare the DP-infused data for 2010 to the summary measures, versus the accuracy measures I just talked about here in the common accuracy measures from the census. And that difference is a sense of geography. Not sure I mentioned this, but the measures that I've been talking about are only available at the national level. There's going to be some state measures come out later on total coverage at the state level, but I don't think it's going to be very relevant. We'll tell us anything. And even more importantly, I guess it's not the state by state differences I think are most important. It's the differences within state that are most important. But the point is, this data that I've been talking about only available from the national data, but from the DP demonstration product, we can make accuracy assessments down to census blocks, as a group or individually, census tracts, counties. And I have to wonder how this DP conversation would unfold if we had similar data from demographic analysis or PES, if we had measures of undercounts and overcounts for every block in the country, and people could see how inaccurate some of that data is, whether this conversation about DP might be different or not. But we don't have that. Let me end with one other comment somewhat related to accuracy, I guess. A lot of the data the Bureau put out before the apportionment data and redistricting data was called operational metrics, had to do with how well the census was taken, things like self-response rates and imputation rates and proxy rates and things like that. And those measures don't measure accuracy directly, but I think they do measure them, and many of them measure them indirectly. And they're an important set of somewhat accuracy-related measures that have been put out by the Census Bureau. And I just wanted to mention that before I end here. So thank you, Jae June.
Appreciate that, Bill. Thank you. And just one quick follow-up. With the DAPS, you get measures of uncertainty with those measurements as well, right?
Say it again?
So with the PES and the demographic analysis,
Yes.
you get measures of uncertainty with those
Yes,
as well,
it's a
right?
sample, and the typical way most samples, you can develop measures of uncertainty to go along with this. Yeah, and as you can imagine, when you get to smaller groups like states and minorities, those sampling area gets much bigger, to the point that sometimes the numbers aren't really very valuable because the sampling area is as big as the estimate.
Great, thank you, Bill. So moving on to Terry, and continuing this topic and kind of the points that Bill has raised. No, we have to commend the Bureau for, I think, carrying out the census for what was an extremely difficult census, the 2020 census. But I know that there are underlying quality issues in the data. That's been the case for a long time. But I think there's been particular interest this time around from stakeholders to understand what exactly those underlying issues are. I wonder if you could perhaps, if I could ask you two questions. Could you speak about more the type of information about census quality and operations that stakeholders have asked for? And perhaps if you could talk about the potential release of noisy measurements and how you think, kind of carrying on from Bill's thoughts, how we might frame and talk about different sources of measurements and errors and, the availability of such information.
Sure, great, thanks, Jae June. I think one thing that's interesting and has been touched upon by a number of speakers today was, right, it's true, there has always been a disclosure avoidance system in place. It has changed, right, the methodology has changed. And prior to this decade, I think a lot of folks just didn't look under the hood, or I like to use sausage making as my analogy, right? And people weren't too concerned about how the sausage was made. They were just happy with the sausage, and they used the sausage in all of their recipes. This time around, I think it's interesting that in an attempt to be more transparent, it sort of, to use, to mix my metaphors, as well, opened a can of worms about sort of how the sausage is made that, I think has really brought a lot of these issues to light. And so I think one thing that is really apparent to me with respect to some of the data that Bill shared was around the undercounts and sort of questions about the quality of the census, right, and whether or not communities are accurately represented, and what does it mean if communities feel like they aren't accurately represented. So one of the shortfallings, if you will, of the data that Bill was sharing is that a lot of it, certainly for communities of color, are only available at the national level, right? And so while it's useful information, it is just one piece of the overall puzzle. It's a snippet, right? For example, with the Asian American overcount, it's helpful to know that, but it's really not that helpful because it is an aggregate data point from across the country, and it doesn't really tell you what is going on, right? So if we could, one of the data points I think that advocates have been asking for and have been asking for many decades from the Bureau is the production of, say, similar undercount data at the state level for the different communities of color, right? Because that is something that could be very important to know. And then, of course, as with everything, the lower level of geography that could be produced, we would certainly love to see it, right? Because you can imagine Asian Americans in New York City might fare differently than Asian Americans in Montgomery County, Maryland, right outside DC. It's It's my hometown, so I'm picking on it. So, that type of information is really what we need to start getting a better understanding of what is actually going on in our communities. And I know my other colleagues have a lot of great thoughts around sort of what that all means. So I'll leave that to them. But that is something that community members and advocates have been asking for, is like, can we get more granular data? Whether that's granular data at the geography level, whether that is granular data, with different sub-ethnic groups, as Bill mentioned. Certainly within the Asian American community, it is so diverse, and the immigration patterns for so many of our communities are different, and so there are very different situations for different communities. And again, once you layer on geographically, there are more complications. So all of that is to say that we believe that more data in those sense would be really helpful. Now, if we pull back for a second, though, I think in talking about what we're here for today in the workshop, to talk about the noisy measurement file, I think, and sorry, Jae June, I'm actually probably going to raise more questions than really any answers, but part of it for me is, yeah, it seems like it could be interesting. I'm sure we could find some interesting facts out, but facts about what? Is it really just going to be about the effect of post-processing? Does it not really get at, is it going to help us figure out what was the actual effect of differential privacy on our communities? Can it help us understand that? I think Bill touched upon this too. Are there things like, would having these files, in addition to everything I've said earlier about concerns about sort of the politics, both within community groups themselves, with the confusion, perhaps anger about the thought that, the Bureau is changing my answers, or why did I bother responding? I believe, Bill, it may have been you, someone had mentioned it in the chat around that. Outside of that, and the politics of what it might mean in redistricting cases, and I think Sam or Clark had mentioned sort of like, if you have two different sets, people are going to start choosing which ones are going to sort of work better for them and start having arguments about that. But really, at the end of the day, what does it do to existing issues that we know are there, that are resulting in the undercounts, right? Whether it's the noisy measurement file, whether it's DB generally, does it exacerbate those effects? Does it just sort of enable or continue, right, that type of the existing issues that are occurring? Or does it, quote unquote, help insofar as masking some of the issues, right? I think in some of the research that had been done on the demonstration products, they showed sort of a, if I recall this correctly, sort of making smaller jurisdiction levels, appear, quote unquote, better, if you will, than it really was. But to me, is that, and this will be my final analogy, is that just putting a Band-Aid on a gushing cut of your artery, right? That is, it's masking something, but it's not really helping the underlying problem. So I think for all of us, even as people are looking at what can be learned from this, I think ultimately, hopefully, we're all thinking about what can we do to make a better product in 2030, but also recognizing that these conversations are also going to bleed into other surveys, right? We know that there are conversations about utilizing DP in whatever form it may be for the ACS, right? And so I think the question of utility, the question of the effect and impact on communities, potential respondents, and the like, are all things that we need to continue to think about today as we are looking at all of these different issues.
Great, thanks, Terry. Moving on to Gwynne, we know that data for AIM people, especially for people living on tribal lands, is being affected somewhat disproportionately as long as we've been measuring census accuracy. I wonder if you could share your perspective on both that sort of issue of how you deal with that underlying error in the data, but also thinking about things like noise introduced by dust, and if it would be helpful for those quantifications and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great question. To talk, or to kind of step back a little, looking into kind of just, there's so many different potential sources of error in the data, some of which couldn't have been predicted, obviously, and particularly in the American Indian Alaska Native data. So looking at it, concerns with the 2020 census data quality began really with the enumeration process. As we all know, enumeration was primarily conducted online in 2020 for the first time. And according to the American Indian Policy Institute's analysis of federal data, just 67% of tribal lands have broadband access. And so this doesn't mean that 67% of tribal residents have internet access. It just means that 60% has the ability for broadband access. So the American Indian Policy Institute also had estimated that less than half of the residents on tribal lands actually had internet subscriptions. And so this meant that much of the population on tribal nations were unable to participate through the main means of response to the 2020 census. So the U.S. Census Bureau did a great job coming up with a lot of alternative ways to enumerate folks on tribal lands. However, as we all know, there was a pandemic, and that disrupted a lot of the plans. Tribal nations also experienced the wildfires, the flooding, the hurricanes, and other natural disasters. And so throughout pandemic, many tribal nations did shut down their borders to control the spread of pandemic and protect their residents. And so this prevented the census enumerators from entering the reservations and counting people through those pre-planned alternative methods, which again were needed because of the reduced access to internet response. And so some tribal nations throughout enumeration were able to open their borders at points during enumeration, but even when that happened, I'd still hear stories from tribal citizens or people residing on the tribe saying that, they'd see a census person driving by and they'd just keep driving and the person would be standing out there and it'd just be like, I don't know where they're going, I'm right here. But because potentially not all tribal nations use the same kind of address system, it can also be harder locating particular residences. And so that could have also impacted response. And there was also the changing timelines of enumeration that were confusing and made it difficult for people to respond. And so that's, just in that one place of the entire 2020 process, you already have a huge potential for error. And then again, the effectiveness of non-response follow-ups was unclear for the tribal nations. And again, in addition to all of this enumeration challenges, there was an additional concern of the data quality within the administrative data and the representation of AIAN folks within that data. So the data processing, the disclosure avoidance system with the use of the differential privacy, as well as the impacts of post-processing on this data, all of this together makes it really unclear where all of the sources of error are for tribal nations. And so through some analyses of the demonstration products for the disclosure avoidance system, I had seen a continued negative impact on data quality for the small, rural, and remote tribal nations. And in partnership with both Spencer and MSGIS, and using a workflow from Dr. Lauren Scott Griffin, Mr. Spencer and I were able to map the impacts of the disclosure avoidance system on tribal lands through the different demonstration products. And as I looked at all those changes, I remained uncertain that the negative impacts on tribal lands created by the disclosure avoidance system and the use of differential privacy and the post-processing processes were able to be corrected enough to protect those small tribes. So again, a continued source of error through all of this. It's unclear. And then through some of my own analyses, after the PL file came out, I looked at particular tribal nations that I knew shut down their borders. So I looked at my own tribe, which I knew we shut down our borders. We're small, we're rural and remote in the middle of Arizona, in the center of the Navajo Nation, who also shut down their borders. So we had those double border shutdowns. And then, again, not everybody has internet. So that was the added barriers. And this made enumeration exceptionally difficult. So Hopi had a total population loss between 2010 Summary File 1 and the 2020 PL file of over 11%. and a loss of the American Indian, Alaska Native alone in combination population loss of almost 10%. And so if you look at, just one portion of the whole process of potential error, Hopi had they had under a 20% self-response rate. So you can already see the beginnings of where this error occurred, and then it continues to compound as it goes on. And then again, Havasupai, another small remote tribe with limited access during pandemic, I think they were completely shut off. They had a total population drop of over 50% and a 60% drop in their American Indian Alaska Native population, and their self-response rate was 0. So their entirety of data was collected through alternative methods. And then that speaks to the representation of the American Indian Alaska Native folks within the administrative data and other data sources having such a huge loss. And then again, looking at one more tribe in Arizona, Navajo Nation, which is one of the largest tribal geographies in the United States, they lost over 8,000 tribal population, or total population, and 5% of their American Indian Alaska Native population. And their response rate, again, was just over 20%. So you can, again, see in a different way how another type of geography, well, size, I should say, had extreme changes, even with, through these different points. So it just shows that it's really hard to identify where the error occurs. It was likely, compounded through all the different stages, and it, all the uncertainty requires a lot of qualifiers when speaking about the census data, but it also results in kind of what Bill was talking about earlier of equity concerns and then diminishing trust in the census data. These tribal populations are able to look at their census numbers and, some of them might have had growths in their population, but now they're seeing that their populations are significantly reduced. So they're going to have less trust in future participation. And even within the last year, I'd had contact with tribal residents who, called me because they weren't certain if they should respond to some of the other census surveys. And they thought it was a scam, to be honest. And I had to be like, no, this is real, please respond. But we can already see the impact that it's having as, people know what should have generally happened and then seeing a reverse. So I lost my train of thought of the question, but really the impacts of, just everything throughout the census process, again, not all within the control of census, really had an impact on the data and the error within the data. And then I'm going all over, but speaking kind of to what Terry was talking about, too, with the noisy data set is, personally, I think it's incredibly useful and interesting, and to be able to look at those statistics at a larger scale could be extremely informative. However, looking at the tribal nations, it's not going to be particularly useful as you are going to see a lot more of those extreme swings at those small geographies. And so then you have that question of equity, where the tribal nations then end up losing out, whereas if you're a larger geography like the United States or potentially, I don't know, even states, then, tribal nations are still unique governments, they're sovereign nations, and then they no longer have the same access or ability to govern that other governments do. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you, Gwynne. And moving on to Karin, as you've mentioned, California is one of the states that legislates against prison gerrymandering. I wonder if you could speak more about that specific use case and how perhaps you have to deal with errors while doing that work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jae June. And before I go into that, I just wanted to say that Gwynne and Terry just raised a lot of the concerns that we also have, and I personally also have, issues regarding small populations. Where is the error? How to get people to continue to actually look at census data and see something that is actually useful, and so forth. So thank you so much, Gwynne in particular, for raising all of those points. I appreciate it. I'm going to add a little bit to this in a second. So back to the reallocation of incarcerated populations to census data. Just to remind you all that our data users, again, Statewide Database, California, Redistricting Data Set, free, public, and so forth, everybody has to use it by law, include small governments, so small groups, and also redistricting commissions, a lot of them on the local level, a lot of nonprofits, neighborhood groups, small community groups, civil rights and voting rights groups, and also really any individual who's interested in redistricting in California. So that's our user community. So when we're talking about the reallocation of incarcerated populations, we had a lot of people that were really interested in that topic. And we were working with a lot of people on it. People came from different perspectives. Sometimes it was a county that was like, oh, we're going to lose a lot of people here. How does that affect us? Is it going to affect funding? And the answer is no, it doesn't. It's just for redistricting. But, others were like, okay, well, where are these people going to end up? How does this affect us? And so forth. So going into the process of, just thinking about how to implement this project, I think we had some pretty reasonable expectations that then unfortunately bumped headfirst into the reality of differential privacy. The overarching question that I still have is, for this entire subsection here, why are publicly available data sets privatized in the census? It just makes no sense to me, and maybe somebody can explain it to me. So the way that this worked out for us was we worked with our Department of Corrections, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, starting in 2012 already, to make sure that we get the same data set from them that they would send to the census, because, logically speaking, of course, I want to have the same thing that the census gets so that I can do a good job reallocating people. It made sense to me, at least at the time. So in essence, when we started to plan for the 2020 redistricting data set, we anticipated that the incarcerated populations that we would have to reallocate would be reported by the census in the same place where the Department of Corrections reported them to us, and enter, differential privacy. And we found out that the total population of these population subgroups would not be held in variance. So why? And I've spoken with Michael, or phrased it with Michael Haas repeatedly, and have said, please, can you please keep these populations invariant? And I didn't even care about the race and ethnicity variables, because after looking at what we were getting from the Department of Corrections, it was pretty clear that that was going to be a no-go, that it was just going to be matching issues that couldn't be overcome. So we got no traction on it. You'd have to consider that the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has a data set, or has a website where they're publishing data sets at least monthly, where they're telling us exactly how many people are where. So they're giving us addresses, they're giving us how many people are there, and they're giving us those monthly. So this is a public data set. This is just a public data set that had a few more variables that we received. And then, of course, the census received a whole lot more. And I obviously didn't ask for that, but essentially we got the same data. So when we received the census data back, and by the way, that was a day when I thought about retirement a lot, we realized that most of the data that we received from CDCR did not match at all, not in total population or in location for that matter. So we spent the next 3 weeks frantically trying to figure out how to reconcile these issues. And then we ended up using the CDCR data, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, to adjust the census data. So even though we knew we were dealing with data that did not reflect the truth on the ground, we didn't see another way to do it. So it's really difficult to explain to people that we had a accurate data set as of that particular day that we then really couldn't use to its full effect. I mean, we did the best that we could. So it was a problem. So going back to a couple of things that Terry and others have pointed out about total population error, and something that John About, I guess, said in his testimony about counties having average errors of plus minus 5 persons. I can't wrap my head around this either, because counties, there's a lot of counties in the United States, and a lot of counties are very, very small. So I'm not entirely sure which counties we're really talking about here. The smallest California county has around 1,170 people, for example. So then what about smaller jurisdictions and off-spine jurisdictions, right? Like special districts, for example? How do we even know what the error there is? Again, California Voting Rights Act. So just think about our clients, the kinds of people that are getting data from us, right? So I have water districts that are now going, that are by district elections, or, you know, you name it. It's school districts, it's water districts, it's all these special districts. We have upwards of 3,500 special districts in the state of California, many of which are now drawing lines. How do we even know what their total populations are? We really don't. And how can we figure out what the margin of error is? And I think that pretty much goes to what Gwynne was saying. We don't know where the error is. And I'll give you one little example from a jurisdiction that I worked with. I think it's really difficult to explain to people in California that we spend upwards of $180 million to get a good and accurate count. And then the data that they're getting back are really not accurate for their jurisdiction. So for example, I have a small jurisdiction as Californian. So there is a small jurisdiction in Southern California with about 35,000 total population. And they have 4 city council districts. So think about this. Their ideal population for a district is 9,000 people, a little less. The 5% deviation would be less than 550 people. So that's already pretty difficult to do. So they were really active in making sure that they got a good count, like super active. And really a lot of even city council members, door to door, flyers, whatnot else. And they felt pretty good about their count. Then they get their count back and we're going into redistricting and they're starting to look at their census block populations, and they're finding out that there is like 3 or 4 census blocks that have lost 1,200 people from the last redistricting. And this is a small jurisdiction. They know that the people that are there, participated, are still there. That particular jurisdiction went the extra step and they looked at water bills. They looked at whatever they had available to figure out whether anything could have possibly happened. I mean, in California, of course, for 2020 census, when you saw these kinds of gaps, you would think, okay, so earthquake, we didn't have one. Fire, not there. You know, flood, somebody, you know, mudslides, any of these like numerous issues that we've been dealing with that may have displaced people, none of that applied. So how do you deal with that? How did this happen? We know that these people were there. How do you explain that to these small jurisdictions, that these people are not there? And then how would a noisy measurements file help me with these issues or help them with these issues? So that's my question about this section. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Karin. And hopefully we can open it up to audience questions soon, but I wanted to turn it over to Fred first. So have you mentioned your use case is more as approaching it as a quantitative and qualitative researcher when it comes to redistricting voting rights. Posing a similar question that I did to Karin to you is how do you kind of deal with uncertainty and error when doing your work, and how does that kind of play out?
Well, that's interesting because as we discussed the jingles factors that are necessary in a Section 2 voting rights case, 2 of them are based on quantitative analysis. And given that I should never know who you voted for, we have a secret ballot unless you tell me. So given that, Jingles 2 and 3, Jingles 2 says I have to show that the minority group in question votes, they're cohesive. They vote for the same candidate over a series of elections. And then the third one, I have to show the non-minorities vote together and they always defeat the minority preferred candidate. That's quantitative. And remember, I don't know who you voted for. So I have no choice but to rely on a scientific method that I can stand on in a court of law and say, I trust my conclusions. So bringing me to answer your question about uncertainty, we always deal with it because we've always had to deal with an area of unknown. We've always had to deal with that when when you're doing surveys and you've got a margin of error, and we've talked about confidence intervals and those kinds of things, those are already there. They're already there. So that isn't new for me. So if I've got to move that over to Jingles 1, then we'll have to figure that out, which I'm sure you all, great people in this room, will help, because I don't want to do it. But we'll have to figure that out, and I'll have to apply that uncertainty there as well. And I want to say, going into voting rights cases, I've gone into community groups, town halls, churches, wherever they want to meet. I've gone to bosses and said, I'm sorry, I cannot draw you a district where 50% of the voters are, 50% of the minorities of voting age, are majority. I can't do it. I can't make anything up, so I can't do that. And I've said it to community groups, I've said it to bosses. So you're always going to deal with, I guess some of this is about an output or an outcome. I don't approach a voting rights case, or in the past, I didn't approach a voting rights case already expecting an outcome. You enter any research probably not hoping you're wrong, of course you want to be right, but you understand if you are wrong, that's where research leads you. You let the research lead you there. And I think we've got to talk more like that. And in terms of error, I go back to before EI, and we arrived at polarized voting with regression analysis. And I would talk to attorneys and go, how am I going to tell my boss that minorities in this particular election supported their candidate by 180%, and the non-minority group was negative 47, because regression gives you that when you apply it in voting rights analysis. But you heard from Gary King in the last, he comes up with EI, and I'm like, thank you. So, because I feel sorry for people who had to stand on a stand and say that the minority cohesion was 116%, because you're going to lose your credibility. Even though I understood it, you have to explain that to a judge. And it had to make sense. So what I hope we get out of this is whatever it takes to make me get back on a stand. I'm not looking to do that, but whatever it takes to get me back on a stand or in front of a community group, I have to be able to tell that group, I stand by what I'm telling you. And with that, whatever it takes for that census data that I'm using, for me to say it, whether you want to hear what I have to say or not, because I've said to many groups, we don't have a case. And they're upset, but that's the truth. So I don't look for particular outcomes or outputs. There is uncertainty in the work because we have a secret ballot in voting rights. We have a secret ballot, and we have to infer. We need a reliable quantitative method, which we have. And with the data, if we're going to question the data, let's question the data. Let's get the pieces in place such that researchers, demographers, statisticians, whomever is going to be the expert for these voting rights cases, and I'll speak specifically to voting rights because that's my wheelhouse. Whomever is going to be there, they have to be able to stand on this. No matter what, they have to be able to stand on what they conclude. And whatever it takes for you all to help us get there, let's get there. Somebody's preparing for a case right now. There are redistricting cases everywhere. And there are experts going, I hope they don't ask me about differential privacy. I hope they don't ask me about DOS. Well, they need to get ready to answer those questions. And lastly, and I'll shut up, Jae June. Lastly, we've got to talk about messaging to the groups that we're out here doing this for. Because getting ready for the Get Out the Count in 2018 and 2019, long before we ever knew about a pandemic, we were grappling with, do we talk about DP? Because we didn't want to do anything to make these groups, and I work with communities of color, to make these groups go, well, why fill it out? We were already worried about an undercount. So we've got to not run away from the problem, but run to it, and run to it with some solutions. And I'll stop there.
I appreciate you, Fred. Thank you. So we had a couple more questions, but I realize we're running a bit late. But I just wanted to see, before I open it up for questions from the audience, if the panelists were okay with that, and just to check if you had any quick points that you did certainly want to make, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to do so before I open it up to the audience. Great.
I'll
Go
go
ahead.
real fast.
Yeah.
Just a quick point with regards to the noisy measurements file that I really wanted to emphasize is just that not everybody has the resources to use the data set, and so I think it is very useful. So I advocate for it to be produced through a research data center as opposed to public data, just as there's such a high possibility as people are looking for potentially alternatives to their 2020 census results and trying to find potentially better data, that there is a high potential for misuse or misinterpretation of what the noisy measurements show. So I think having it go through an RDC as well as having it tied to a lot of technical assistance would be really beneficial to kind of curb some of that potential misinterpretation of the noisy measurements data and what it can and can't do or show.
Great. Thank you, Gwen.
Yeah, and as a, if I put an academic hat on, I would love to see a noisy measurements file. As a practitioner, as an applied redistricting person, I would not want to see a noisy measurements file while I'm in the middle of line drawing. And I would also not want to go to court with one, honestly. I think that this would, depending on what unit of analysis, basically, it would be released. So first of all, it's difficult to talk about a noisy measurements file that we haven't seen, right? We don't know what's in it. I have some questions about whether, depending on what we're getting, can it be aggregated or not? So there's some issues there. I have like 2 pages of notes on this particular section here right now. I think that it would be extremely problematic for applied redistricting to get, margins of error, say on a block or even a block group, while we're in redistricting. I think it would make redistricting endlessly more difficult if it came out at the same time and on the units of analysis that we're using to draw lines. And I personally would not want to see, as a line drawer, a margin of error on census data on small units of analysis. I think we would end up in court quicker. I think we would never get out of court. I think we would have to argue about whether the number 28 is actually large or small. And I think it would open up redistricting to constant ambiguity, and the politics would just be unmanageable. And usually redistricting does have a timeline, and I can just only imagine some of the jurisdictions that I dealt with, they would have flown through every timeline had this been an issue. And I think there would also be a much higher understanding required from judges that would get these cases, because usually that is already an issue, to make sure that this very complicated issue gets explained properly. So I just think it would become indefinitely more complicated. And then for line drawing, we would need to do constant recalculations of the districts. It would affect redistricting software. We would have to rely on vendors to give us algorithms that would allow us to do this, to do these constant recomputations on the fly. And I have really very little faith that that could be done. And then for, cities, for example, let's just take my little city. If they actually know that their jurisdictions may or may not have lost some population, would that then mean that they can go to court? Will they go to court if they have lost 2,000 people? Because this is affecting their funding. I just think that there's a lot of issues that we need to grapple with on this particular point.
Hey, June, could I add 2 points quickly if I could? One is that among my colleagues, there's two kind of people use census block data, the smaller data. One is redistricting, which I've heard a lot about. The other is school district demographers, where they're trying to carve out attendance districts or project attendance and so on. I've not heard that voice in this meeting or other meetings, so I guess my point is in future meetings, it might be useful to have someone who can talk about how schools use small area demographic data from the census. The other point I want to make is in terms of measuring child well-being, what's critical, as you can imagine, is connecting children to their parents. For example, the poverty rate, you need to know the income of the parents to understand the poverty status of the child. Any other measures like that, parental employment, family structure, and so on. If I understand correctly, differential privacy kind of breaks that statistical connection between children and their parents. They apply the random error separately to those over 18 and those under 18, and that's where you end up with 160,000 blocks with children but no adults. And for measuring child well-being, I think it's critical for us to have measures where those children are connected to their parents in a systematic way. I know the data coming out of the census that has those kind of joins, I think the Bureau calls them something like that, tables that connect children to parents. There's only 2 of them. They're coming out in what is now, I guess, a supplemental DHC, which is now scheduled for sometime in 2024, I believe. My point is 2025 is the date I heard where they're likely to introduce some kind of formal privacy to the ACS. And one of my points is the ACS is the most critical data source for child well-being. I'm getting nervous that they're not going to know whether they can do this right or not until 2024, which is only a year or maybe 2 before they introduce it into the American Community Survey. So my ask for this community is to focus on figuring out how to apply differential privacy in a way that doesn't break the bond between children and parents. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. I'm going to open it up to the audience, and I think Michael has a question, if you'd like to go ahead. I can pass you this if you'd like. Or this one. Here you go.
So I just wanted to respond to a couple of Bill's points there. The first is, I mean, there's nothing in DP itself that prevents keeping the household structure. And in fact, we are keeping that in the detailed DHC product. What forced us to cleave the persons file from the units file in the PL data and in the DHC, what were the design specs that were given that we had to have the microdata output requirement. And in order to do that, we had to separate the persons in the units. But that's not DP's fault. That was essentially a policy decision about the design specs for the PL and the DHC. But we are keeping that household structure intact, as Ashwin talked about this morning, for the detailed DHC product. As for your comment about the ACS, there's still a lot of work to be done on that. We said in, I think it was 2019 or 2020, I think it was 2019, we said, 2025 at the earliest for the ACS. There is no timeline for actual implementation of formal privacy for the ACS. We're researching improvements to disclosure avoidance, including possibly the use of synthetic data, but that would not be differential privacy yet. That is on a substantial time frame to get done. We're trying to be very transparent about that. We are going to be very active in engaging with data users as that gets underway. So don't worry that that's going to be rushed at the last minute. So we are still in the research phase. There will be plenty of opportunity before any decisions are made.
Thank you. That's somewhat comforting.
Yeah.
Just for clarification, so you said that this link was broken in the PL and the DHC because of the microdata requirement. So does that mean that it would not be broken in the noisy measurements?
No, in the noisy measurements for the PL and the DHC, it would still be broken because we run them through the algorithm in 2 separate stages. That was the microdata requirement. Also, that was an attempt to limit the sensitivity of the queries so that everything that was being done for PL and DHC were simple counting queries. Ashwin talked about this morning the massive increase in sensitivity when you have that link preserved. We decided that a different mechanism would be much more efficient at addressing privacy protections for those joins. But yeah, so it is cleaved in the PL and DHC, but we are keeping household structure intact for the detailed DHC.
Thank you. Any other questions? I haven't checked the chat. Yep. So I'll go over here and then go to the chat next.
Oh, it's on. Okay. Thank you so much. Again, this was, for me, a lot of excellent points. And I really appreciate the detail that Gwynne went into, describing all possible sources of error that we encounter even before we begin any type of sanitization. And I think this difference, believe Amy made earlier as well, in terms of, she specifically talked about undercounting, right? But, and I think, we all agree that that particular problem in additional sources of error, especially in the past, over the past year or so, or 2 years, where are we now, 2020, 3 years ago, when the census was run, right, because of COVID, that those are additional errors. Those errors have always been there, right? That has to do more with data quality. And I think it's important for all of us to really think carefully about how we can distinguish those errors in order to then to better model their errors, right? And again, we often talk about in the, I guess, technical community, errors, let's say due to sampling to simplify, and we know there's way more errors than just sampling error, and then errors that come from the privacy models that we're using. So this is something that many people in the community are thinking about and thinking about carefully, and I think this is another reason why many of us are in support and asking for noisy measurement files, because in there, at least, we feel we could better understand and technically address distinction between those, again, simplified two types of errors. We know there's many, many more errors. And if we are able to provide better technical solutions to the Fred's points, if I understood you correctly, you're happy that ecological inference came into play, and a new model, right, for ecological inference came into play and helped you, I guess, to quote you, I stand behind what I am telling you. You want to stand behind what you're telling. I think many of us here who are working on the technical problems, and we want to have these discussions, is because we really want to find a way to provide tools so that indeed you can stand behind what we are telling. Jeff said earlier, I don't know where Jeff is, we want the correct inference. And yes, I know there's a difference between, is it an accurate count versus is it an accurate inference? But these, even if there is some error in the count, inferences is the end, what you are presenting, I think, it in your cases, and what we all have to stand for. And if I can, so I guess I'm making more of a comment rather than a question, because I really, I think this was a terrific session, at least for me. Again, as I said, I felt I learned a lot. Maybe to Karin's point, when she asked about why we sanitizing, she said sanitizing publicly available data. I'm not sure if you were directly speaking to the census, because you're also speaking to the certain types of data sets in California. I mean, what's obvious here is that there are many different stakeholders, and there are many different needs, expectations, requirements, and most of all, I am not a census employee, I guess, but we all know that there are certain legal requirements, and they differ at the federal level, at the state level, right, by certain government agencies, and somebody can release certain data publicly if they wish, if they don't have legal requirements to maintain confidentiality of their respondents. I don't know how data were collected, and I don't know what the certain rules are, right? But I think this is at play. I don't know when we say why is public data made privatized. I would like to hear maybe what public data you're specifically referring to. Previous census data, or speaking about census data, was also sanitized, right? This is, I think, this point was brought up earlier as well when we said, except that some demographer feel, right, the experience has been, the error seems small, right? Or at least that was the assessment, that the error seemed small. And I think many of us over the last, I don't know, decade are questioning, was that error really that small? And that what brought up some of the new methods and methodologies. So I am all in favor with, and with Fred, let's run to the solutions. But we want to have reliable solutions. So that's a comment. And maybe, I don't know if Karin wants to talk about the public data.
Wait, did anybody want to follow up on that? No.
If it was if it was a related point, perhaps you can go and then I'll give a chance to Karin to respond if you'd like to, or we can go to the comments, I think, the questions in the chat as well. But I know.
Why don't people respond to Sasha's points
Okay.
first, and then, because my questions were a little different.
Yeah, happy to just explain what I was talking about. I was talking about the total population of incarcerated persons for each facility in California, which is recorded on the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's website. So just talking about where they are and how many are there, not the demographics, not anything else. So this is an official data set from the state of California that is available to everybody. And that was given to the census. And then when it came back, people were not where we knew they were. So that specific piece was what I was talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. Adam.
Cool. Maybe now I realize I do want to actually add something that is on Sasha's point and to Karin's. If the census were to release the noisy measurement file, it would be possible to adjust it for that kind of issue post hoc in a way that is really hard to do currently with the post-process thing. Anyway, but that's not really what I wanted to ask about. Okay, so I actually had a question for Bill that I put in the chat, but I'll ask it. Which is sort of, you mentioned the connection between kids and parents and sort of like the kinds of things you want to know. And a question that I thought might be interesting, especially in the context, given that Census is thinking of how to deal with detailed DHC and stuff, is sort of, well, what specifically about those relationships are, what are the aspects that are most important to see in the data? And I realize that there's sort of no, there's like lots and lots of stuff you want to know, but are there dimensions that are really especially important, maybe a subset we could focus on that would, be a useful starting point or something like that? And to provide some context, I was part of a collaboration, a number of people here, with a team at Harvard called Opportunity Insights, but they're economists who look at relationship between parental income and look where people live and how kids do later in life. And one of the things that they pointed out was the kind of old school disclosure avoidance techniques, when applied to the data they care about, often really skew the analyses very heavily in a way that things that are different, that need, there are differentially private ways to do those analyses that are much better, so they claim anyway, so they say, in terms of actually the information they're getting. Okay, so I'm bringing this up because I feel like if the kinds of things that you want to know, or some subset of them could be, if there were like a smallish subset that we could start from, maybe it's possible to do not only better than whatever, Census might have been thinking of so far, but also better than, what was done in 2010.
I suppose one could trim back the number, just to give you one number, the kids count effort that ranks the states every year on child well-being uses 16 measures, 9 of them come from the ACS. And so that's how important the ACS is, I guess. And I would imagine a group of people could say, yeah, these are the 5 most important or something, but the more relevant question probably is if people think they've had this measure for 15 years and all of a sudden the Census Bureau is taking it away, that's probably going to be more important and what's going to jeopardize progress on this. And I don't know, when you talked about using other disclosure avoidance methods in the past on a file, I'm not sure what you meant by that.
Oh, yeah, I meant cell suppression, swapping, things like that. The things that were done that we, of course, we don't have full details about exactly how they were performed. So they did the opportunity. Well, okay, we could discuss separately whether or not the opportunity insights experiments are relevant to your use cases, but they were looking at things along those lines.
Piggyback on this, I don't think we might be more successful in eliminating the geographies for which data is produced rather than the measures themselves. I think that would probably be they're probably more likely to find cooperation there than reducing the measures.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to sort of say reduce the measures so as just like where would be, really productive places to focus effort, but yeah.
Great. Sorry to cut this short, but I think we're a bit short on time. Sorry? Oh, I see. Got it. I didn't see that. Yeah, maybe we could just turn to that one question, and then if you'd like to unmute yourself, Shelby.
Oh, yes, thank you. Just a quick one for Karin. I completely understand your concern about releasing the noise measurement data and that all the complications that can create for you that in the court. But I wonder, let's say if that does get released, I wonder if there's any way that can help you to make argument. I'm just thinking about, had the Census Bureau actually released the measurement error data without that top down, you would even have a harder time to do anything because you have negative counts, you have harder time to defend anything you do. Could this measurement error data released give you arguments, say, whatever the top down actually is producing, at least the more kind of I wouldn't say more reliable data, but at least it looks like a better data. Is there a way to say that is actually you're relying on better data than, because Census Bureau made an effort to the post-processing kind of help you? Because whether they release or not, it's there, right? The other side can always argue, say, it's there. How do you know anything can be trustworthy? But might this help in some way?
Yeah, thanks for that. Jae June, is it okay if I respond?
Yep. I think we're, okay. I know we're short on time, but go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for those points. I just wanted to be clear. I would like the noisy measurements file. I just don't want it while I'm drawing lines. And I think we have to be very careful with what we're advocating for and on what unit of analysis that file should be released. And, basically just look at what makes sense. And just in case I also wasn't clear earlier, I think post-processing is a necessity. I would not want to sit there with data that are not post-processed. I cannot explain negative people to the population groups that I am working with. So we're gonna need post-processed data. I just think with respect to the noisy measurements file, we gotta carefully think about when and how and what unit of analysis really makes sense. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And thank you so much again to the panelists. It's great to have this conversation, and I will be bringing it to a close. So I don't know if, I know that's the end of the schedule for the day, so I'll pass it over to the next person. But great. Thank you so much.
Well,